Hello everyone, welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name's Charles Godfrey, I'm the director here. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to an event this evening where we're going to be discussing a book, Roadkill, Unveiling the True Costs of Our Toxic Relationships with Cars, which has been written by Henrietta Moore and Arthur Kay. Dame Henrietta Moore is at UCL, where she holds the position of the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity and chair in culture, philosophy and design. Henrietta is an old friend. We sat together on DEFRA's Science Advisory Council, and I have learnt more about the social sciences from Henrietta than I think from anyone else. So something I'm very grateful for, Henrietta. Henrietta's co-author is Arthur Kay. Arthur is a specialist in infrastructure and development, sits on a variety of different things, including the Royal Academy of Engineers, and is a board member of Transport for London. And Arthur, I believe your parents and godparents are in the audience this evening, so particularly... So no pressure on you today, Arthur. And what we're going to do is first, Henrietta and Arthur are going to say a little bit about their book and the arguments within it. And then we're going to go to a discussion where Arthur and Henrietta will be joined by Tim Schwannen. And Tim is from the home team. He's in the Department of Geography, where he's Professor of Transport Geography. So with no more ado, Henrietta, would you like to come? Yes. And Arthur, if you want to sit in the front row. Yeah.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here to listen to us, and thank you, Charles, for that gracious introduction to both of us. Arthur and I have been looking forward to this event immensely, and we hope that you enjoy it as much as we know we are going to do. Now, cars are the most successful consumer product ever made, and we love them. They represent freedom, convenience, and autonomy, and so much more. Yet they're not the drivers of the future we imagine them to be. As we speak, over 1 billion cars are stationary. They're actually taking us nowhere. This bit, I think. Yep. The imaginative life of the car has it always in movement, like the famous American movies we're familiar with. But the reality is rather different. In fact, cars are stationary around 96% of the time. Over the 70-year period from the first car in 1886 to 1955, we went from 1 car to roughly 25 million. 1 car per 110 people. And today the total stands at 1 car for every 5 people, roughly 1.6 billion cars for a global population of 8.1 billion people. And 1 billion of them are in cities. The car's insatiable need for space is reflected in almost every city in the world. In London, 14 square kilometres of the city's land goes just to parking, and that's about the size of 10 Hyde Parks. In Barcelona, Spain, cars account for just 20% of journeys, but occupy 60% of the city's space. And in the United States, there's more space for parking cars than there is for housing people. But to talk and write about cars involves coming face to face with people's life choices and with what happens when we disagree with them. It also squarely locates us in the debate about science and truth, fact and belief. In modern societies, science is crucial for evidence-based decision-making. And a recent study of trust in scientists in 68 countries found that mostly people do trust scientists, but that mistrust in scientific evidence, even by a small vocal minority, affects perceptions of scientific evidence as it is deployed in policy making. And as a result, a well-established narrative expounding an ongoing crisis of trust in science and scientists has taken hold right across many societies. And this is particularly the case with issues like climate change and indeed the thorny question of what to do about cars. Now, studies have shown that trust is affected by what we call value alignment. people who feel that their concerns and values are not reflected in the values of scientists may doubt the trustworthiness of those scientists. Science-related populism is often framed as a perceived antagonism between what are termed ordinary people and common sense on the one hand, and academic elites and scientific expertise on the other. The media sphere promulgates distrust and even suggests that scientific truth claims are inferior to the common sense of the people, whoever they may be. That means inferior to the self-evidence that everybody knows. And so evidence does not trump value. Now, one point I would like to make is that when this happens, neither side is listening to the other. Academic scientists often believe that it's a matter of education, and individuals who hold populist anti-science beliefs are mistaken. However, recent research suggests that there's only a very small positive relationship between tertiary education and trust. Scientific populists deny that science, evidence, and truth are deployed for or acting in the public interest. People often reject scientific findings because of their beliefs, attitudes, and values, as I've suggested. And this often is because science contradicts what people believe to be true, but worse than that, it can also appear to counter what people have actually experienced in their own lives. If your experience is one of exclusion, injustice, and lack of provision or respect for your life experience, then distrust is the very likely outcome. What people fear is that something is going to be taken away from them. And often this results in a situation where people know the evidence but don't believe it. We do know our cars are trapped, and we are trapped in our cars. But we're also trapped in our thinking about cars. We're in a vicious cycle of car dependency. We are also car blind. The car is shaping and constraining our choices without us realizing it. We do know that cars are bad for us and for the planet, and yet we're driving more and more. Americans clocked 3.2 trillion miles in 2022. That's the equivalent of making about 17,204 round trips to the sun and back. But journeys like commuting really make us miserable. In an international survey, those able to cycle and walk to work reported the greatest levels of happiness. And given the time drivers spend in congestion, this makes sense. Traffic has slowed car speeds in cities like London to around 8 miles an hour, at which point you might as well amble along in a horse and cart. So when we can't stop driving, is it that we're not worried enough about dying prematurely, don't believe in climate change, or don't care about the coming generations? Perhaps. But what is clear is that the car has become symbolic of our refusal to change course, even in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence and widespread public unease. Even though cars allow us to go about our daily lives, is this really freedom? As individuals, we are being asked to make a number of changes, quite large changes in our lives, while political and business elites are either actively sabotaging transformational change and duplicitously stalling on relevant actions, or enshrining green agendas and innovations while simultaneously signing into law new agreements for car subsidies and oil exploitation. If this was a movie, no one would be able to follow the plot. The result is that we are conflicted. We drive while vaguely hoping that recycling our trash and taking one less vacation by plane will sort of balance things out. But how are we envisaging and conceptualizing the changes we need to make? When we think about climate change, many people often worry about having to sacrifice modern freedoms, things that have given us that feeling of autonomy, liberty, and control in a very unpredictable world. Whether it's air conditioning, grab-and-go packaging, or even the internet. And if you're not concerned about waving goodbye to all of this entirely, maybe it's because you're committed to finding a clean, green version of all your favorite polluting habits, from low-energy web browsers to biodegradable glitter. Many of us defend our freedoms strongly, but the kinds of freedoms we think about are very much 20th century ones. It's have what you want, do what you want, go where you want, consume anything you want. Whereas the freedoms of the 21st century probably need to be much more capacious than that. Instead, we argue in the book that what we should be doing is thinking about expanding our notions of freedom in the 21st century and how this time we might craft them together. We may think that cars symbolize freedom, but are they really allowing us to live the best lives we can? How do we formulate the notions of freedoms when it comes to a machine that, since its invention at the end of the 19th century, has killed approximately 60 to 80 million people, more than the number of deaths in World War I and World War II combined? Globally, one person is killed by a car every 26 seconds. Now, the philosopher Isaiah Berlin made a distinction between negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from coercion or constraint, to do as you wish. Yet negative freedom is not an absolute. Societies have always had to decide on some constraints, on some rules and principles. After all, humans are social, and we like to club together and to cooperate. Positive freedom is the freedom to live the best life you can. Berlin argued that positive freedom must ultimately be about self-realization, about being yourself at your best. It's not just something you're given, but it's something that makes demands of you. It requires you to be conscious of yourself as a thinking, willing, active being, bearing responsibility for your choices. Now, there are many choices in front of us. Transitions are complex, but change is possible and a lot is happening. The former mayor of Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa, built hundreds of parks, bike tracks, bus lanes and sidewalks during his time in office. And these were linked to libraries, hospitals, schools, nurseries, and water and electricity systems. For Peñalosa, a protected bus lane wasn't just something keeping a cyclist safe. It was a symbol that showed that a citizen riding a 50-pound bike is equally as important as one driving a 50,000-pound car. A bus stuck in traffic represented not just inefficiency, but inequality. You might be able to choose whether to drive a car or not, but can you choose whether to be affected by climate change, air pollution, and biodiversity loss? The poorest people in the global south produce the lowest level of carbon emission, but they're equally affected, sometimes disproportionately so, by climate change and pollution. Their lives on the land are much more dependent on the richness of biodiversity than those who live in urban centres in the global north. One of the definitions of freedom must surely be the freedom to live the best life you can. So who gets to decide the life you can lead? There is, I think, a careful distinction to be made between treating people with the respect they deserve in their own right versus treating them as a means to help you achieve your own goals. For example, farmers in Kenya are struggling with coffee crop yields because of changing climate and weather patterns. When we, in Europe or the United States, continue to fail to address issues of fossil fuels and carbon emissions, we implicitly accept that Kenyan farmers should have lower life prospects so that we might protect our own lifestyles. We are actively treating them as a means to our ends. But Kenyan farmers are fully aware that they did not create climate change. They recognize that they're being asked to fix a problem that is not of their making. They're carrying the burden of unfreedom. And their disillusionment is made worse by the fact that they know that the residents of countries in the global north must view their lives as less worthy than their own. If we treat others as a mere means for our own purposes, we effectively curtail their freedoms. We do so by damaging and undermining their livelihoods, even if we don't intentionally do so, and conceptually through processes of non-recognition and denigration that may then shape future actions against them. Closer to home, it's estimated that every person, including every child in the United Kingdom, whether they drive or not, subsidises general car use by about £900 a year. Choosing to drive is one of the most expensive decisions drivers and governments can make, both because of what you pay personally and what you pay socially. And no doubt Arthur's going to give us a few more factoids on this and scientific evidence, I think, actually, not factoids, scientific evidence. Now, public debates about policy trade-offs, fuel subsidies, aid transfers, green transition plans, traffic calming schemes, and climate change action are shaped, actually, by larger ideas about who matters and why. As we face the climate crisis, we need to build new institutions and new practices to deliver the freedoms that matter to us in a changing world. So when division threatens, when we need to take account of others' perspectives, and when choices involve trade-offs, I think we might be able to use a Kantian framework, as we suggest in the book, to approach this problem. And the Kantian framework is a simple one. What can I know? What might I hope for? And what ought I to do? So what can I do? That's not about what you should know, but what could you know? What is it possible for you to know about the world around you and about the consequences of your actions for you and future generations? The second Kantian question, what can we hope for, is about a new way of relating to the problems we face and the constraints that limit our freedoms. There is all around us increasing vocal recognition that what we need is freedom from the accelerating harms of the past century: noise and air pollution, unsustainable forms of living, unaffordable housing, environmental collapse, toxic politics, social alienation, and intergenerational racial and gender injustice. But change cannot be just about destroying the life that we've come to live. We need to be able to believe in new shared freedoms for the 21st century. And this can be the freedom to send your kids to the shops on their own, like those living in superblock neighborhoods in Barcelona can. Somewhere to rest and enjoy greenery away from the noise of city traffic, as seen in the dismantling of a busy highway in Seoul to restore a medieval stream basin. Or freedom from rising heat and unpredictable weather, where the impermeable shell of road surfacing can be replaced by flood-absorbent paving, shrubbery, and tree cover, as in Karachi. So finally, what ought I to do? Well, we already have many of the simple approaches and technologies on hand that we need to reduce overheating, air pollution, and flooding, and make our cities safer, greener, more resilient, and more livable. Often it does not require technology at all, rather learning more from each other and nature. Exciting changes in cities all over the world are demonstrating that we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Rather, urban spaces can provide us with new freedoms if we loosen our grip on the car and reach towards solutions that suit us and are already being implemented by communities and policymakers around the world. Putting people first is all about improving the quality of everyone's lives, and the best way to do that is to get together to make a change. So, Arthur, please.
Good evening, everybody, and a real honour to be here at the Oxford Martin School. Thank you very much for that, Henrietta. I wanted to pick up on this conversation about freedom, and particularly looking ahead in terms of where we're going over the next 70 years in terms of particularly this role of the car and how we can live well and live better together in cities. So the two kind of big ideas that are being sold to us and being brought to us by mainly West Coast America and a little bit China are the electric car and the autonomous car. So maybe starting with a small show of hands. Has anyone driven in an electric car before? I have. So that's loads of people. Anyone in an autonomous car? I'm guessing maybe Tim has, and quite a few other people. Are these Waymos? Are these robo-taxis? What are they? Robo-taxis. In Austin, was it? Or in, yeah.
In Sweden.
In Sweden, okay, cool. So my piece is going to look a little bit about where we're going to be going in terms of some of these technological advances and what the impact that's going to have on our cities, and how we as citizens, we as policymakers, we as academics, we as thinkers can try and make sure that that's a life that actually genuinely impacts us and makes our lives positive rather than what I fear maybe some of the realities that these have major negative impacts in terms of the way we live together. So does anyone know what this is here? This is a model made by, yes, I think some nodding heads here. So this is the Futurama New York City World Fair back in the late 1930s. And it was sponsored, you'll never guess this, by General Motors. And they decided that this is actually the vision that they wanted to see in the world. They wanted to have a world where you could zip from A to B very, very speedily, and you'd have an amazing time in doing so, because everything was going to be interconnected, it was all going to be very fast and very safe, and it was going to be, in the words of the Lego movie, everything would be awesome. And this is where we were just the other day launching the book. This is Sheikh Zayed Road in Dubai, which I think looks uncannily similar to General Motors exhibition. The car industrial complex, as we call it in the book, has successfully designed, built and exported a certain model of urbanism built around the car, for their own predilections and profits in order to be able to deliver this model of urban design in the city. And so the question that, and this is with reference to Peter Norton, who's written about this in his book Autonorama, but this is a vision which has been invented and reinvented again by what we call the car industrial complex. And they've, at each stage, ideated and then sold a vision that they acknowledge full-heartedly and earnestly that yes, cars are polluting, yes, cars can be dangerous, yes, cars congest our cities, but trust us, if you buy the next model, everything will be awesome. And so this idea of where they're going into these next generations, and my piece of this talk today is saying that we're entering this next era of Futurama 4, and that we need to be very careful about, as I say, there could be some real benefits that come from this, but we also need to not embrace wholeheartedly some of the myths and the red herrings that the car industrial complex will seek to sell us. So this is relevant for a very specific reason, because this was the front page of Waymo's website last week when they announced with much fanfare that Waymo, Alphabet's, the owner of Google's autonomous car division, is coming to London next year, 2026, a very exciting moment for many. And it has the potential to be exciting. I'm going to talk you through some of the potential benefits and opportunities that exist here, but then also to come into some of the threats of how we can proactively and effectively regulate this also. And Waymo have announced very proudly that this is going to solve people dying on roads, number one. This is going to solve congestion, and this is also going to solve a large element of the pollution challenges as well. And there's also the robo-taxi. Mr. Musk has called autonomy for Tesla a $5 to $7 trillion market cap situation, he said in his latest earnings call. And so this is not just a kind of a rounding error for how big business is thinking about this. This is betting the future of very, very large companies on this vision of autonomy and what the future could be. And this is what the world, and see if you can do a spot the difference here of the kind of fear. This is what fossil fuel car cities look like. This is what electric car cities look like. And this, I fear, is what autonomous car cities may look like. And so is there a way that we can integrate these options? Because what Roadkill, the book we wrote, really stresses, is not saying no cars. It's saying that the car is a really great invention in many ways. Autonomous cars have the potential to be another really great and valuable invention in many ways. But we need to be, we as citizens, we as decision makers need to proactively and on our framework and our timeline, invite cars into our cities to be one amongst many mobility options, not the default and the only autonomous options. And so I'm going to talk briefly about some of the potential benefits. Now this is kind of, so there are lots of things that could happen well if we can correctly regulate and manage and proactively make decisions to engage with autonomous car companies and ensure this happens correctly. I think as Tim and I were grumbling about in the room next door before coming on stage here, the fear is that organisations like Department for Transport, even Innovate UK, are so wholeheartedly embracing the innovation, the positive side of the innovation that comes with it, that they're not correctly assessing some of the risks and some of the challenges that come from it. So if I run through a risk of potential benefits, so it could reduce congestion and pollution. And this is really around this idea that if you can move from a model of access rather than a model of ownership, you can in theory reduce the gross tonnage of car in the world because we can share cars together through a autonomous model. The other piece is that it could release land for better streets and public space. And this is, I guess, twin to the same argument that if you can free up some of the parking space, Henrietta spoke to how the 20th century model of car ownership has dominated our inner cities in terms of the sheer volume of car parking space and the gross tonnage of cars in our cities. And so there's the potential that it could free up some of that space if done really elegantly and correctly. There's a big issue in mobility generally, which is called the first and last mile problem, which means that being able to get to these these big transport hubs and transport nodes often means that you're not right next door to them, and therefore being able to get easily and in a frictionless way to those big nodes and then be able to take public transit on those longer distances between London to Oxford, for example, means that you could be able to solve that last mile and first mile problem very effectively. Critically, and what Waymo really led on in their press release that they put out last week, is that it could, and this is a real positive, expand mobility for vulnerable groups. So disabled people, shift workers who are working at really inconvenient hours and a range of other things, this could be a real benefit and provide a growth both in terms of their mobility options but also the economic opportunities that come from this as well. So that's something really not to be underestimated in terms of the value of, but also, as they've already led in the UK with, this is something that they're going to be using as a bit of a Trojan horse to be able to make sure they can get autonomy everywhere all the time because of this argument. And then finally, it could also equalise access to opportunity. We know, Tim knows better than we do about the geography of jobs, and in terms of how this is kind of good employment and good economic opportunity is often tied to as small as one's postcode, and that this could, in theory, free up some of those elements of it. So those are the good things, but I think the good things probably end there. I think the more likely and worrying element of this comes in terms of what we are looking at in terms of the number of vehicle miles driven globally. So Henrietta mentioned in terms of the United States the sheer volume that we actually drove. And throughout the course of the 20th century, we've gone from a world where we were driving more or less very short distances in cars that didn't work that well, to, as of last year, we drove collectively over 17 trillion miles globally. So this is a long way. But the fear, and this is an extrapolation looking at kind of three different elements, is that the fear is that we're going to be moving from a world of driving 17 trillion miles to a world that we could, in the coming decades, be driving globally 100 trillion miles each year. And this is through three different cogs in this machine that we're looking at. The first is autonomous cars, that if we do adopt autonomous cars wholeheartedly, there is nothing to stop us hopping in. The director of Innovate UK's mobility unit, who's in charge of all in theory, all innovation in the UK in the mobility space, told me that the real benefit of autonomous cars is that she'll be able to jump in her car, fall asleep in the south of England, and then drive to Scotland and wake up and go on a hike in the Highlands the following day. And this was kind of the pinnacle of success as far as she was concerned in terms of mobility. And it would let her do that, which is awesome, but it wasn't necessarily thinking about some of these knock-on effects in terms of negative impact. So the first piece is autonomous cars and the increased miles driven there. The second is a study from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, which came out just last month in September, which looked at how the Norwegians have achieved what governments like the UK only wish they could do, which is that they, as of last quarter, 94% of all cars bought in Norway were electric. So this is a huge policy win as far as a lot of the kind of electric, or the kind of net zero agenda is concerned. However, in doing so, they both subsidised this to tune of £46 billion over a 15-year period, but also in doing so, they found that through induced demand, that people actually drove their cars about between 10 and 20% more than their internal combustion engine counterparts. And so if we then extrapolate that across populations and say that if we can achieve what the UK is hoping to achieve, Minister Alexander, our current Transport Minister, proudly announced in July a further £650 million subsidy to get people to buy more electric cars. So this is not quite 46 billion, but we get it, we're on a journey there. That induced demand in terms of driving that 10 to 20% more is going to further extrapolate that. And then the third piece, which we may come to talk about briefly in the panel, is around the emerging middle class in the global south. Currently, car ownership per household in America is around 92% of households have access to a car. In sub-Saharan Africa, 4.2% of households have access to a car. In India, around 8% of households have access to a car. And so if we're going anywhere close to the American model in terms of urban design and development, we're going to be in a world where we're very quickly up at that 100 trillion miles travelled mark as well. If we look at the additional potential negative impacts as well, we're looking at potential for, let me just find my place here. So unchecked urban sprawl, we're looking for modes and models of development which are going to continue to have our cities sprawling further and further away as the cost of moving between places reduces through autonomy. We're going to be looking at more pollution and congestion, not less. Even with a driver, shared mobility services like Uber and Lyft actually spend 60% of their time driving around without a passenger in their car. And then that's with a very expensive driver sitting there and absorbing that cost there. So if you actually remove that driver, which is the kind of the dream in terms of these mobility services, you're going to really reduce that cost of idling to almost zero. And then I think critically in terms of some of the, and I think in a strange way, I think where we may find an alliance with some of the divisive politics and some of the activists we've spoken about in the past in terms of anti-ULEZ protesters, for example, is around how the role of big technology and cyber security threats actually converge in some kind of bizarre Venn diagram here to bring these two agendas together. So the big technology companies are the ones driving the autonomy revolution. And so we're going to see a world very quickly where private monopolies over mobility and data is going to sit within the hands of a handful of firms, but also critically a handful of very, very wealthy guys in Silicon Valley who are going to be controlling our lives and our mobility and how we can live those lives in a better way. And the final piece in terms of a threat, just to conclude here, is around the vast, and I think as yet fully recognized, it was mentioned very briefly in the National Strategic Defence Review, but the vast cybersecurity threat that, and cyberkinetic security threat that autonomy places as well. So where in a world where a hack becomes a mass casualty event where you can use cars as 1 to 2 ton weapons whizzing around cities, where you can bring entire city blocks to a halt, and in a world where you have asynchronous updates in terms of software and cybersecurity threats, it becomes a very real issue in terms of cyberkinetic warfare, which is actually spoken about in a recent book by Andrew Roberts and General David Petraeus. So in concluding, I want to, and I'm very much looking forward to getting this into the panel and to hearing your questions on this as well, but in concluding, we've already spent a huge amount of the 20th century losing this fight. The real car industrial complex started flexing its muscles in the years after the Second World War. And cities have spent decades trying to unravel and unpick some of those challenges. And we can't afford another century of some of the unintended consequences and outcomes of this. So the real question as we think as engaged citizens, as policymakers, as academics, is around, as autonomous cars arrive, as say they're coming to London next year, who do they serve and who's the real beneficiaries of it? It's a very relevant question for the Martin School, and I know you've done a lot of work on this in the past. And my kind of urgency here is that this is not a thing to start thinking about in 1 year, in 5 years, in 10 years. This is something that not after the pilots have happened in London and they've already built in with the DFT and TfL and the Innovate UK team and got them all on side. It is not after the market has already decided. As I say, Waymo is here. Musk is going around saying this is a $5 to $7 trillion market cap situation. So autonomy, if used specifically, and I'm using autonomy as a broad term here, those who are in the industry will know that there are different levels of autonomy and there's a whole bunch of different use cases where autonomy can and should be integrated into different society, into different elements of it. So autonomy can be included as one of many potential solutions that are needed to help build sustainable and livable and prosperous cities. But the big risk is that we take the path and end up in a more car-dependent and more entrenched one. But my call to you today is that this room of policymakers, academics, engaged citizens can lead the debate and make real change. So thank you for your time and attention.
If you go on the next one, Tim. Well, thanks, Henrietta and Arthur, for both a fascinating and sobering account and a prequel of a much longer argument in the book, which I see you have subtly placed on the front table there. And there will be opportunities to buy the book afterwards and to talk to Henrietta and Arthur. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a panel discussion led by Tin Xuanan, our Professor of Transport Geography here. And we'll do that for 20 minutes or so and then go to the floor for questions. So, Tim, let me start with you about some comments and questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for your excellent introduction. And I think sort of positions the book very well. I think this is a really timely and important book. It is very well written. It is clear. It's refreshing. And in some ways, it's unconventional. And it is unconventional because both of you are relative outsiders to the transport fraternity, because it is still very much a fraternity. And you're very explicit about that. And I think that is really, really helpful because it leads you to do things that we don't often see being done in relation to transport. So I really like this framing in terms of freedoms. And actually, this is something that colleagues and I have been working on as well. We can talk about that later. We take a slightly different approach, and we are less generous to Isaiah Berlin than you are in the book. And I can say that because he was an Oxford academic. I think another real strength of the book is the focus on this car industrial complex, and as sort of the key culprit of many of the problems that we face today. And there's a strong sort of political economy undercurrent to the book. You don't use the term, but it's very clearly there, and this is very much the social science perspective that we absolutely need in this area. And the critique that you were also making, Arthur, about electrification and automation is very welcome. Although there is always the risk with this that we make too little of these technologies. We did a Delphi study a couple of years ago. A Delphi study is where you bring a number of experts together to think about and to deliberate about highly uncertain policy questions. And what came out of that was the huge degree of uncertainty and ambiguity in these effects. Also around the level of rebound effect. So rebound effect is what Arthur was talking about, that we'll see many more miles being driven with the rise of, with the popularization of autonomous vehicles. I think there is agreement that we will see more miles rather than less being driven, but how much is very unclear, and particularly around zombie miles. So these vehicles driving sort of without any passengers, without any people around, sometimes looking for parking space, sometimes looking for new customers, is really, really unclear. The fact that you are outsiders also means that there are things where I think sort of the argument could have been pushed a little bit further. And I think one of the key aspects for me that I think you could have made more of is the car as an object of desire. Because you do sort of start with Thelma and Louise, which I always use with lectures, and recent cohorts of students have no clue what I'm talking about. So this is clearly a generational issue. But for me, I think you put perhaps too much emphasis on the cost side of things. So if you look at the book, at the contents, the first two chapters have sort of a very clear mobility focus, and then the third is about time and cost. But the question of desire and the car as this object of desire is not brought out as much as I think it is, because it's an extraordinarily achievement of the car industrial complex that it has made this car and this object of desire. And many people sort of thinking about cars that they could, or that they might want to drive if they had the budget to do it. So I think that's one thing we might want to talk about. The other thing I was going to talk about is that the diagnosis that you offer for the problems is incredibly strong. But then when we're talking about what we can do in terms of actions and interventions, you are perhaps reliant too much on what the transport and urban planning community is saying. I think that there's a lot there that is very useful, and I'm sure my colleagues will hate me for saying this, but we also know that what people like me tend to preach is insufficient to get us beyond automobility. It works in pockets of high density central parts of cities, but in suburbia generally it is too little. So we need to do more. And I think related to that, you make a lot of cities, which I think is very important, but we should also be clear that cities like London and Bogota are not the norm. It's also not the places where most people on the earth live, right? We need to think more about second, third, fourth, fifth tier cities, and think about them sort of in a really multi-level governance context, because one of the things that you see is that cities in general and the people working in them on transport don't want cars, but they feel constrained in all kinds of ways by national and supranational processes. So in the UK, we see this very clearly that cities don't want cars, but national policy is essentially about technological substitution.
Yep.
Sort of switching from fossil fuel cars to electric. We see the same across all of Europe, but the problem is cities are very much dependent on national governments for funding and for regulatory frameworks. So there is this tension that we really need this multi-level governance structure in place, particularly also if we want to get at that car industrial complex, which is very much transnational. So that multi-level complexity, I'm not here to make things easier, but that to me is sort of really, really, really key. And one question I want to end with is about capitalism, because you're sort of silent on that and how you see it, and I'm just wondering if we can really move beyond roadkill within the confines of capitalism. For me, that's very much an open question, a question I'm sort of thinking about a lot, but I've been thinking about this in 25 years and I still haven't found the answer. But I think it is worthwhile reflecting on whether we need to sort of really sort of perhaps accept that the ruins of 20th century automobility are very much also the ruins of capitalism, and we have to deal with that and maybe sort of think much more in much more radical ways about the future than we have been doing until now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Henrietta, would you like to respond?
Yes, I would. Well, I'd like to say that both Arthur and I in another life would have liked to be transport engineers. And if only we had another life, we might well be transport engineers, and if only. I mean, but also to say that I think that if Arthur had his way, there would have been much more about desire and cars in the book, because he kept wanting to put in more and more of these adverts of cars where they're, going through the night and there's no one else on the road, and and everybody is very beautiful and all the rest of it. And I kept saying, look, this argument has been made, we can't have all these adverts, But the point you make is a good one. I mean, cars have been sold to us as something that's very much part of our intimate lives and our identities. And we all want to have cars, in a way. And one of the great challenges here, as Arthur suggested, is that once we can have a green car, a totally electric car, I can feel that pull myself. At any mad moment, I might go out and buy the new Land Rover, if it's entirely green. Although I'm not going to do that, but I can feel that pull, right? And it's there, I think, for many people, is, you see another beautiful car and you think, oh yes. It's like seeing adverts for large houses in the Sunday newspaper. You really want to suddenly buy this large house, and it's impossible and you can't, but, So yes, but I think attacking that head on is something that's also been done quite well in quite a number of books written sort of 10 or 15 years ago about the car, and so we were trying to avoid repeating that and very much thinking about the future. So I know that's a rather feeble explanation, but I think the power that the car has over us emotionally is something that cannot be gainsaid. And when you ask people why they drive, they say, well, it's absolutely convenient. And I point out this case of a woman who lives in Barcelona who found herself before the new traffic calming neighbourhood came in, was trying to jump in the car early in the morning with 2 screaming children to get them to school and feeding them, getting them in the car, and then getting in the car, and then the car's in a traffic jam, and then you're late for school, and then there's a drama, and then there's nowhere to let them out, and then there's loads of other cars, so they can't get out of the car, and they've got to go to school. Right? Traffic calming neighbourhood came in, and the elder child, who's 9, now walks to school by himself with his mates. And she takes the little one, stops off at the playground on the way, they have a little play. She drops the child and comes home, right? None of that stress is there. So the thing about convenience needs to be addressed as well, because we've not just been sold this story by the car industrial complex, but we've sold it to ourselves. And that's what makes it so very difficult. We all believe in it. You know.
Arthur. Well, yeah, thank you so much for those points and comments. I think the one around cities and megacities is one that I'm really, really interested in. We write in the book in chapter 12 a bit about this, but the reason why and the book, I should say, is very focused on the car in the city. When we are talking about exurban, suburban, and rural areas, this is very focused around the density of cities and solutions there. And that may sound very niche, so it's a car in a city. Okay, how more niche do we want to get? But as Henrietta said in her opening comments, 1 billion cars in the world are in cities. And when we're talking about things like autonomous cars, then they're mainly focused around how you can find kind of micro-mobility and short haul journeys for those kind of things. So it may sound a bit niche, but it's still where we kind of are trying to make this argument and focus it. In terms of that's where a lot of the problem is, but it's also where a lot of the solution is as well. So, and we particularly focus on both mega cities and mega regions. So these are kind of 50 to 300 million people regions of joined up cities where you have a huge amount of density within them. So we're thinking in the kind of Boston to Washington corridor in the East Coast United States. We're talking about this famous blue banana, which runs through from kind of Manchester through Europe down to northern Italy. We're thinking about the southeastern region of mainland China. And so these are regions where you have very, very large populations, but if you can untangle the infrastructure there is where we're arguing the best return on investment is. And actually, in doing so, you can solve a big chunk of that billion car problem in just those, let's say, 10 global mega regions. And it does sound a bit myopic, but that's kind of one of the kind of core pieces where we're trying to say that could be. And the role of elected mayors as increasingly global figures. Around 55% of all countries in the world have a population of 10 million or fewer. And because of the kind of world order and the way it's been operating, we often use the nation state as the tool. And as I say, because of the car industrial complex, how it's integrated into the nation state, we often use the nation state as a tool for industrial policy, as a tool for economic policy and diplomacy. But I guess one of the challenges for this book is what role can mayors, who often have technocratic control over a transit authority, like in London and Transport for London, and their amazing role they could have as a potential change maker. And I know that Bloomberg and the C40 and other networks are trying to bring these mayors together to try and make some of that change and kind of create an inflection point in terms of urban transit.
Tim, do you want to?
Yeah. Maybe on that last point about the mayors, if you read the book, it's very clear that one of your sources of influence is Carlos Moreno and Hidalgo and sort of the 50-minute city. But I think Carlos Moreno really misunderstands the role of mayors in many ways. Because not every mayor has the same capabilities as we see in Paris or in London. But I think the other point is about these mega regions is the point about coordination between cities within them and cities and suburbs within them.
Yep.
And they're very good examples of how tricky this is, not so much from sort of use of cars for passenger transport, but for freight terminals, where you see that cities start and sort of neighboring municipalities start to compete with each other for getting these facilities. And then companies who provide these facilities basically say, well, if we come to we'll bring so many jobs and or we bring so much wealth to you. And kind of this competition and this coordination problem is one that we really haven't solved. And this is where I think a social science perspective and sort of really thinking through the governance of this really needs much more attention. And if there was a second version of the book, maybe in the list, in the crib sheet of solutions, more on sort of that coordination problem would be very helpful.
That's absolutely right, because first of all, the political economy approach is essential, and second of all, actually understanding that this is a whole systems problem. And very often, what happens with transport is that one bit is addressed, leaving other things to move in a negative way in relation to that new change. And the result then is a lot of pushback from the public, number one. But secondly, a lot of competition over such things as, who will be, developing the port that will be used, or who will be using, which part of the Manchester Ship Canal, or who will be, who will be the first port of call here. And I think that part of that is the point about this multi-scalar approach, which has to be part of the whole systems approach. So, government regulation has to be there, and there has to be national government regulation. There probably also has to be supra-government regulation on this, and this is a very hard problem. It's the same climate change problem, I think. What's good about choosing cars as a way of thinking about some of these more intractable problems around transformation is that, first of all, we all have a familiarity with the car. So we're not dealing with the abstract here. So this is very important, because most of all, when you talk to people about, what do you think about climate change, even if they believe the evidence, which half the population doesn't, but if they, even if they believe it, then the question is, well, what do we do about it? And what do we do about it? The academics are saying, well, there are a lot of uncertainties, a lot of imponderables. That's the message that comes across. And so people then say, okay, well, if there are imponderables, then the best thing to go is to go to the local cafe and have a cup of coffee, right? Because what else can you do with all these imponderables? Right? And I think part of the problem here is to get people to think about where there have been successes and to learn from each other about how those successes work. And there have been some multi-scalar successes, not necessarily about cars. Interestingly enough, we could probably have used some green energy transition examples. Offshore wind farms, for example, would be a very good example for the UK, where regulating the market in the right way at the right time allowed that change to go through, right? And if they would do that. But when you see what they do, so instead of saying, okay, we know we need to move people to many green new jobs, they say, oh my goodness, there's been a cyber attack on Jaguar, right? And that's got 1,200 jobs at risk, so we're going to throw a lot of money at Jaguar. So there's a constant problem here about trying to go back to a moment in the 20th century when the car industry was employing very large numbers of people. Now, actually, of course, the value to the UK economy of the car industrial complex is huge. I don't know exactly. We were quoted last night a number of trillions of dollars, which Arthur probably wrote down, but I didn't. But one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the amount of money that goes investment into the car industrial complex, then look at the amount of money that goes into green mobility. So the green mobility investment is probably something like 56 billion overall in the economy. If you take trains out of that, it's down to about 25. And once you think that air pollution costs the UK annually something like 22 to 27 million pounds a year, depending on what your figures are. And we have people in the audience who can correct me on this. But the point is that, the amount of investment you're making and the cost you're creating, and the government could actually step in here. And it's very, very interesting that they don't. They don't invest into those spaces and places where they could make a massive difference to lives and livelihoods and employment, and constantly keep propping up the old ones. That's my view on it. Charles will disagree, but this
well, I was just going to say, you mentioned Canton and Isaiah Berlin, so I'm going to mention Jean-Claude Juncker.
Okay, very good.
Who said that often we policymakers know what to do, but we don't know how to get elected once we've done it.
Yeah.
And I guess the question I had for you, is there a narrative that can stop the petrol distribution stations from being barricaded as they were a few years back? How can a narrative be developed that doesn't get into the culture wars that we see in the States and are becoming increasingly prevalent over here?
Do you want to start that one, or shall I go? Okay, well, I mean, I think this is a really good question. Well, first of all, we've got a situation where this is easy pickings for those who want to cause these problems. And often it's a very vocal minority in the public media sphere and in the social media sphere who are doing this. Most people are actually not attacking other people on the internet all day long. I mean, they haven't got time to do it, nor are they holding up placards saying down with the WTO. Actually, the number of people in the UK or around the world who do that is very small, but it's very easy for that to be captured. That's what that study I referred to showed. You can have very broad investment in people's trust in science, but you only need a small minority to come out and say that this particular low-traffic neighbourhood scheme is a problem, and everybody goes immediately towards that problem, right? So part of that is, I think, by amplifying the story about the successes that there are, and there are huge successes. I mean, if you take London, and London is a very specific case because actually it's a rather easy case to use, and that's the point you're making. But if we took even some of the smaller cities where there have been attempts to reclaim the street or to create more green parks or to improve urban forests or to work on biodiversity or to calm traffic in various ways and allow people to walk and roller skate to school or whatever it is they wish to do, you find that once there was a lot of pressure when those things were brought in, but once they started to take off, people were wholly in support of them. So we need to hear more from those people. We need those people. And we need to hear more from the local authorities and the local businesses that surround them. I think business has quite a big role to play here. Because for a long time, you know, when congestion charging, which has just been introduced into Oxford, I understand, so this is a good thing in my view, but when it was introduced in London, where I live, there was a huge row going on, And take Marylebone High Street, which is a street that you might know in London, even if you don't live in London or go there very often. And it's a rather posh street with rather posh shops and posh restaurants on it. And they all complained that they were all going to be, terrible things were going to happen to them as regards a congestion charge brought in and so on. And the only thing that's really happened to them, the worst thing that's happened to them is that Waitrose moved in. After that, they haven't had any problems at all. They're all making much more money than they ever made before because they'd absolutely misunderstood how many people actually walk into Marylebone High Street and wish to walk on Marylebone High Street. They don't want to drive their car there.
Okay, so we will stop promptly at past, but we'll go to some questions for the floor. Lady in the green jersey here, and then gentleman to the left there. Really, and if I could ask brief questions so we can get lots in.
Really excellent presentation there. Very excited about your book. I love the comment that the gentleman from geography said that maybe we cannot achieve change under the mantle of capitalism. And I'm thinking, you were asking what could we know, and I'm suggesting perhaps we should be asking what would maximising mitigation from climate and ecosystems collapse look like, because it's not a question we're looking at the moment. We're looking at propping up business as usual.
Thank you. I think that's a very good comment. Gentleman there with the... you had it stolen from you.
I'm a cabinet member for adult social care. I did run highways in Oxfordshire for the 2021. You said about Juncker, and there's a mayor of Spain who I prefer to quote, who said, "I'm no more responsible for where you park your car than where you leave your fridge or leave your cow." And he's been elected many times in a beautiful city as a result. I think I'd like to get your views on how we design urban spaces, because I think taking away people's cars, if I was to say to my residents in Wheatley, you're no longer allowed to have your car, I'd be in a gibbet cage. But if we design a space and then say, here is somewhere where you can live which is car free, and that's a choice for people to move into, then it's a different ball game. So I just want your views on urban design and how we can change it in that space.
Well, do you want to answer that question before we go to the next one?
So, and I'll just briefly on the capitalism one as well. I mean, we did a panel on Monday bringing together entrepreneurial solutions for kind of early stage entrepreneurs who are building mobility solutions but not including the car. So it's not necessarily, the book's not making necessarily an explicitly anti-capitalist argument or anything like it. It's saying there are great economic opportunities out there through still having cars but having less of them and using them very judiciously and on the terms that put people first rather than cars first. And also there are businesses that could be very big businesses that can be grown through public transit, micromobility, even walking and cycling and the rest of it. So that's my personal view, and there are lots of really exciting things happening out there through that too. On the urban design point, it's one of the big challenges of, I think, a lot of the books that we've read about cars and public transit, that you often end up in a relatively tight discussion around the car specifically, or the train or the bike or whatever it is, rather than thinking about the urban fabric, and they are so integrated. I think we're at the Martin School, and it's all about interdisciplinary thinking and solving some of these grand challenges, and I know this is probably kind of second nature to Tim, but one of the challenges in writing this book is around how you bring together both transport planning pieces with urban design pieces, with some of that kind of broader and richer philosophical piece as well into a single place. So without giving you kind of a crib sheet of different urban design and technical solutions that we have in the book, the main thing would be going back to that pyramid, the inverted pyramid that Henrietta showed on her 5th slide or something, which was that very simply putting people at the very center of urban design, and then everything cascades from that. And that should be people who are walking, wheeling and cycling at the very top, and giving them, and because everyone is able to move around through those modes of transport, and then the private car, of which fewer people own, should be lower down that cascade. So I'd say as long as designers, urban designers, planners, policymakers are always remembering that, I think a lot can come from it, and there are different typologies that then flow from that.
Yeah, question over here. We'll take a couple more from the front and then go to the back.
Yeah, thanks. There are millions of us who don't drive, and quite a lot of us look as external observers and see a car not, as you refer to, as an object of desire, but more as a dangerously addictive drug that kills far more people than heroin every year. I mention this because what you haven't mentioned, modal shift, is implicit in what you're saying. And we seem to be communicating modal shift very badly because of that desperation to continue using the car, or the inability to consider, haven't we really got to go back on modal shift and start thinking about this from ground upwards, about how we get to the people who are not engaging?
I agree with that. Let's take a couple more questions and then we can come back to that.
Hi, thanks. Fascinating. As somebody spent a lot of time thinking about air quality. I think one of the aspects I'd like to pull out a little bit is the health benefits. Health is a big driver of both cost and impact. And for me, you've not really brought out the health benefits that drive from this, which have this kind of larger impact in the way that we do it. And I think to your point, though, I would absolutely emphasize that bit around systems thinking. If you just think about the car on its own, you will fail. You've got to have that systems view on how you're going to redistribute in that system, else you will fail. But so health benefits is my question. Can you make it more real?
This is all music to our ears. I mean, I couldn't agree more and couldn't agree more. I think it's yeah, definitely agree.
Well, I think we are communicating the whole issue about modal shift very badly, and that's partly because people, perhaps national and local politicians find it easier to say there is a war against cars than to say we really need to make a change here, and it's a good change, a positive change. But there have been changes that have been made by politicians taking a very positive view of working alongside local communities. I mean, that's what happened, in the Netherlands in the 1950s, and it was easy to do that in a way, because you didn't have to argue about particulate matter or whether or not the scientific evidence was right. You just had to agree that killing children wasn't a great plan, and people were actually able to get around that, and they did make that change. And we are making it. I mean, I ran into someone the other day who is a mayor of a small city, and there are now 130 of them have got together to declare themselves the bicycling mayors for 26. I mean, I'm sure you know these people. And anyway, else is going to do something with them in the future. But again, what's happening there is you're getting a lot of young people who are running startup businesses, moving into those kinds of cities and actually working on some of those kinds of solutions. So you can begin to address how you can act within the space of the larger structure of capitalism. The reason why I don't usually speak very much about defeating capitalism is because, you know, I really think I won't manage it before I die. So I try to focus on the things I think I can make a difference to and to change. You know, to go to Paul's point, yes, the health stuff, which you know lots about and have done so much on over the years. I mean, this, I think, if people really understood more about the health and we talked more about the health, but not from the point of view of you don't know the health data, but from the point of view of we really understand you're already struggling with your health, right? We really understand that health is a part of your livelihood uncertainty, that it's really bad for you. You know, you're going on these late night shifts, you know, and you've got an unwell person at home, you can't cope, you know, that all of these things coming together and actually working on that, I think would make a big difference. And the latest stuff, which you'll know much better than me, but I mean, the stuff on air pollution, on Parkinson's, on dementia, you know, on fertility in men and women, I mean, on what's happening to preterm birth and rising heat and so on. I mean, the figures are absolutely horrifying. And I gave a lot of quite scary figures when I was speaking tonight, but there are, unfortunately, a very large range of even scarier figures, you know, out there. And I think we're not telling the story right for the modal change because we're not talking about the health stuff at night. But we need to talk about it in terms that mean something to people themselves who are already struggling with a lot of difficulty, many people.
I should say the last question was from Paul Monks, a distinguished professor from Leicester visiting Oxford today and recently stepped down as Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Right, we're going to go to the back, the lady at the back there.
Hello. Yes, regarding your vision of the future, I gather it also involves a vision of social change so that people don't want to drive cars, or very few of them want to drive cars. But do you envisage that perhaps many people may still want to drive cars and therefore laws may be necessary to ban most people from driving cars and just limit certain categories of people to being allowed to own a car?
Let's take another question and then Arthur will answer that because he knows about the answer to that question. We'll take another. Just take one here.
I'm afraid we won't get round to everyone's question. It's wonderful, there's so many.
Hello, I'm Daniel Shaw from Green Speed. So for 30 years I've been campaigning for speed limits of 20 and 55, and I've had a bumper sticker which told the car behind me why I'm driving at responsible speed. And I give them away to men who have everything except the ability to drive responsibly. And one of your colleagues, actually my colleague, Robin Hickman and David Bannister of Oxford, they gave evidence to the Transport Select Committee saying the speed limit has to be reduced, and it was regarded as politically unacceptable, impossible. I just wonder which chapter of your book is headed speed?
Would you like to take those two questions?
Yeah, that's two great questions, thank you. To the first one, we're definitely not saying don't drive or don't own a car. I think we argue in the book that there's a role for the car, and if you are someone who particularly I think the first line in fact says this book is for you if you hate cars or love them. If you really love cars and this is a part of what we call in the book your rich life, kind of your good life, then we argue that there should be a role for you to drive and enjoy driving. We rather ironically, well, not ironically, but we quote someone called Matthew Crawford, who's a philosopher who's written a very good book called Why We Drive, about his love of driving and of the open road, which may seem like an unusual person to quote in this book. What we're really focused on is about those 17 trillion miles. I would argue that a rounding errorly small amount of miles driven are by people who are driving and loving it. A lot of the time are people who are driving through necessity, through car dependency and not having a better option. And what we're kind of really pushing for is providing people with safe, reliable, affordable alternatives to driving, and driving can stay as a mix amongst that. And as we move into a world of kind of electric cars and autonomous cars, there's a place for them, but it should be on the terms, again, to that pyramid of needs. Humans at the very, very top, first, second, third, and then underneath that and much further down the chain is the role of the private car, is our view in the book. And you can, take us up on it. Henrietta, over to you on the others.
Now, just remind me what I was listening to you, which was fatal when it's got to fit. I have to keep the whole question in my mind. Now, the second question was about speed. So, yes, I mean, we're very much in favour of reducing the speed, and the number of The number of people killed every year by cars is still absolutely enormous. And one of the problems is that cars are actually getting bigger because they're being sold to us as spaces that you can do new things in. So, you know, I mean, never mind the 1960s when everybody thought they were pursuing, you know, the first stages of their intimate life in the back of the car. You know, we now do many other things in the car. And the car industrial complex is very keen on that because actually what they're interested in is how much attention time they can get to you whilst you're in the car, and that's now a lot for various reasons. So you'll notice that people do have cars where their children are watching films in the back and so on, you know, all of this kind of stuff. So the car is expanded, but it's a much heavier machine. I mean, a current SUV is about the same weight as a small tank, and if it hits anybody, then you're not going to be very likely to survive that. So we could do many things that we could do to move multiply in this area, and I think the modal shift is very important. But I don't think that that what we're talking about here, the kind of regulation I'm in favour in is regulating aspects of the market, regulating the cost of things, distributing those things in certain ways. I don't think you can ban people from driving. I don't think people are going to. Banning people from doing things doesn't work very well. Banning people from drinking alcohol never worked. Banning people from various other things doesn't work either. So I think it has to be a change that comes about, a social change, a social transformation.
We're coming towards the end, but Tim just wants to
sum up.
say something.
No, I just wanted to echo what you're saying. Banning isn't working very well, but there is one thing that we haven't talked about, and that may sort of prove to be a very interesting changer of how things are, and that is when we sort of see litigation and sort of car companies being held accountable in court for some of the damage, and particularly on the health side, because the evidence base is rapidly expanding. We now know much more about sort of how lives lived driving and being driven are sort of leading to accumulation of all kinds of health conditions. And I think that's a really interesting set of developments that may change some of the things we've been talking about. And that is a much more powerful force of change than legislation or regulation, I think.
Yes, and there's also been some litigation around advertising, car advertising. Yeah. Car companies are being hauled up for claiming all kinds of things, you know, green figures here and green figures there, and, you know, benefits. And insurance companies also hauled up for saying things like, you know, that driving is good for you and it reduces your tension and so on. I don't know which car they're driving, but anyway.
So the one thing we promise at the Martin School is we finish on time. So with many apologies to people both online and in the audience who wanted to ask questions, sorry that you didn't get the chance, but do come and join us for a drink afterwards, where you'll have the opportunity not only to buy the book, but to talk to Arthur and Henrietta. On the frontispiece, you have the wonderful quote from Goethe, which I'm just going to repeat. "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free," which I think summarizes much of what you said. It's been a really fabulous talk this evening. Tim, thank you for your wonderful challenges. Please join me in thanking all three of them for such a good event.